very, very big welcome to everybody. I'm thrilled to see so many people here. Welcome to another episode of Leaders Link, where we come together with special leaders from around the world who've got something significant to say about some of the important issues that we face. And very excited to have Nigel here for this conversation. I know many, if not most of you, but there are definitely some new faces here. For people that I haven't met before, a big hello. My name is Lindsay Levin. I'm the founder of Leaders Quest, and we help leaders and companies align purpose with profit to help people thrive on this beautiful planet of ours. Many challenges around doing
for your benefit
right now. Sorry? Oh, who's that? Yeah. So a very big welcome to everybody. Nigel, really excited to have you joining us. Thank you very much for making the time. I know you've got a crazy schedule right now. For people who don't...
everybody tells me that life is slowing down and it's a time for reflection, and I haven't noticed that. I seem to be busier, but not traveling though, which is, so it's lovely to see everybody here and to have such a international group and see a lot of old friends and a lot of new faces as well. So thank you for making this happen.
Not at all. No, so excited, and hopefully this conversation itself will feel a little bit reflective and give you a chance to kind of pause and step back and think. So Nigel's had a wonderfully rich and diverse career. He spent time in industry and manufacturing and business, ran a manufacturing company, comes, as he likes to remind us, from a very kind of gritty, real world. And then for the last 20 years, he's worked on businesses' response to climate. Most recently, 4 years with We Mean Business, the We Mean Business Coalition, which is a coalition of business leaders around the world working towards a net zero future. And then at the start of this year, earlier on this year, he took on this new role. I even have to look up the name. He's got such a long title, the High-Level Action Champion for the UN Climate Talks. And even
you got it wrong. You got it wrong. It's the High-Level Climate Action Champion. It's a 5-letter acronym. Yeah.
So in a minute, we're going to ask you to tell us what the hell that means.
Okay.
But before we talk about the job, I know one of the reasons so many people have tuned in is that so many of us around the world felt that 2020 was climate's year. This was an incredibly important year for climate. Very important talks in Glasgow at the end of the year have obviously had to be postponed, along with just about everything else. And so the first question I want to ask is what is going on? What does this mean, this hiatus, in terms of the incredibly important UN conference that was planned for this year? So just give us a sense of what's going on and what's likely to happen.
Thanks, Lindsay. Well, I mean, first of all, I think the postponements, I mean, everybody understands that. I mean, rightly, leaders in pretty much every field, certainly government leaders, whether it's local or government or national government or multilateral, are very focused on the very real human crisis right in front of us. And that's both a health crisis and it's becoming an economic crisis, right? So, for example, the incoming president of COP26, Alok Sharma, who's the Secretary of State for Business, you know, he's giving some attention to climate change. We had a virtual ambition forum run by the Small Island States, hosted by Belize yesterday, which he spoke at, and I did some facilitating. But he's spending most of his time trying to figure out how to stop small and medium-sized British businesses go bust and millions of people going and being thrown on the streets unemployed. So I think everybody understands that the health and economic emergency are, and that's why actually it's not the UK's decision about whether or not the COP's delayed. You remember, this is a massively multilateral process with over 190 countries, and they have a subset called the COP Bureau with 12 members who make decisions like this. So they decided earlier in the month to postpone, and we don't know yet when. They've just made the decision to delay, but haven't decided when. So hopefully early June, maybe a little bit earlier, but around about end of May, beginning of June. I think by the middle of June, they'll have made a decision as to when the delayed date will be. It'll definitely be in 2021. And you know, they're consulting. There's a lot of consulting going on right now with all the different countries, and there's a complicated international agenda. There's a G7 meeting which the UK is also chairing, a G20 which Italy's chairing, and you know, and there's the delayed biodiversity COP, which is going to happen in China. There's going to be a big UN food systems summit. So there's a lot to pack in. Obviously, August's pretty much out because Europe goes on holiday. June's pretty much out, I understand, because there's the European Football Championships are going to be held in Glasgow, so that's going to tie up the police, and there's a lot of heads of state turn up, so they can't do two big events at once. January, February are probably out because it's too early, so people don't want to risk postponing twice. So I think we're looking at probably, I'm with my team doing scenario planning based on a possibility around May and a possibility of a full year's delay till November, and we really don't know. And there's pros and cons of both, but we'll know within a couple of months.
So, tell us a little bit about. I want to ask two related questions. One for you to describe a little bit your role, but then also to talk about the advantages or otherwise of the delay, because on the face of it, people might feel hugely disappointed, but as we've discussed, actually there's some advantages to having longer and to maybe raising ambition. But first of all, tell us about the role. What does it mean to be this high level action champion?
So it may be just, some of you know this in real detail about the kind of international construct around climate change, but for those of you who don't, obviously the fact that we're going into COP26 means this is the 26th such meeting. It's the conference of the parties. So the parties are the parties to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. And historically, that's been a meeting between countries. And it's very difficult for countries to agree anything, especially when all 190 plus of them have to agree every comma. It's a very high bar of unanimity, 100% unanimity for UNFCCC. And of course, national governments aren't the only people with political and economic power. So about 2 or 3 years before Paris, the UN system started opening up and saying we need to hear more voices from businesses, from cities, from faith leaders, from civil society, from investors, from states. And California is the 5th biggest economy in the world, but they don't have a seat at the table because they're not a national government. But what California does has much more economic impact than what many countries do. So that process started with Ban Ki-moon inviting a group of us into a room in Warsaw in the COP 2 years before. And then in Peru, in Lima in 2014, there was a real opening up and a recognition that although the legal processes between countries, the political process has to include those other voices that have real stake, that have real power, and that have real ability to influence for good or for bad the direction that the politics goes in. Because when negotiating teams are negotiating around climate, they're not just negotiating with other countries, they're negotiating with their constituents at home, of course, because it's so, I can remember in Paris just very vividly realizing that the Indian delegation were not just negotiating with Europe and China and the United States, they were having to negotiate with their politics at home because they had to be seen to get a good result, or a good enough result. So so that in Paris, in recognition of this growing awareness and growing involvement of what the UN system calls non-state actors, the countries, the parties to the agreement actually created this role. They said, we want to create a role called the High-Level Climate Action Champion that will run for 2 years. Every year there's a new presidency of the COP. This year it will be the UK, and ask every president to appoint a high-level climate action champion to work with those constituencies, business, investors, civil society, cities, states and regions, etc., to drive ambition and action alongside, and then to use that to try and encourage and support more action from countries. So it's kind of, the job is basically to encourage, applaud, cajole, provoke more ambition and more action from those who are not national governments, and then to use that to help raise ambition within the formal process.
Right. Now, I mean, a lot of people have been looking at these talks and assuming it's going to be very hard to make progress because of where we are with national governments, let alone, the current challenges that we've got. Why did you say yes? What made you say yes? Why do you think you can have an impact in this role?
Oh, you mean when I was asked? Well, sometimes you get asked to do something and it's just like you've been preparing your whole life for it. It was a real no-brainer. I mean, I have my grandfather was a Quaker, and he influenced me a lot. Quakers are an interesting group. They're kind of anti-establishment. They don't really believe in hierarchy. you know, they sit around in a square or a circle, and it's a society of friends, although it's a religious group. And that no one wears fancy clothes, no one has fancy titles. But he was also very, you know, he was a vice chancellor of a university, so he was kind of an establishment person. So I think I've kind of inherited that. You know, I was kind of a, you know, Cambridge Blue and head boy of the school, but I have a little bit of an anti-establishment streak. So the opportunity to both be use my experience in business and use my experience in the NGO community with CDP and then Women Business and my understanding of the process to influence it in a positive way with kind of one foot inside the establishment and one foot out, just felt like just too good an opportunity to actually, you know, bring my network, right? I mean, it's a lot of this job is about the people that I know and have had the privilege to work with, many of you on this call, because governments don't know this community. Governments don't know just how many millions of amazing people are working in very different ways. Some of them, you know, waving banners on the street, some of them, you know, writing financial disclosure regulation, some of them taking countries to court. But there's you know this, there's such an amazing community of people who understand the problem, are committed to doing what they can about it. So in a way, I feel like I have an opportunity to both use the authority of government to help us all be bolder, but also empower governments with the sort of passion and experience and drive of this community, so that governments are also bolder. So yeah, it was the only parallel I have was when I met Paul Dickinson for the first time when I was studying at Schumacher College, and he asked me if I would come and work with him before we'd ordered the starter, and I said yes before the starter had come. That was the beginning of my entrepreneurial period as a climate activist. But yeah, it was a very easy decision to make.
So what are you hoping, Nigel? What is possible given how difficult the political climate is?
Yeah, I think well, I think a lot's possible. And of course, there's a lot of uncertainty now, and the world could go in some very dark directions if we have, depending on how deep this economic crisis is and how it affects some countries, which will be deeply destabilized by it. So you know, I'm hopeful in the sense of working towards a good outcome, and I think that we have a chance to do it. I'm not naive that there are still strong headwinds. I mean, it feels like, and it's still early days, this crisis is raising awareness of our interconnectedness and the fragility of the current system, and the sort of fragility amplifier that is inequality. So there's a lot of really interesting conversations and thinking now going on about how we, as the Secretary General of the United Nations says, how we build back better, how we use the needed economic stimuluses to drive not just a sort of macroeconomic recovery with all of the systemic fragilities intact, but how we actually shape the future economy. So we invest in the new clean industries, not the old polluting ones. We you know, isn't it interesting that we've got a UK Conservative Prime Minister levelling up, and a Republican US President with the biggest ever citizens' basic income experiment in the history of what that quite left-wing idea. The ideas like national service are coming back in favour, but not military service, but nature service, or you know, or civil service in education and health and nature. So I was pretty positive when I took the role. Funnily enough, I'm more positive now. A couple of reasons. I think that, you know, the Paris mechanism is set up as a ratchet, so you keep moving forward, you never slide back. And there are some notable exceptions. We'll talk about America in a minute. Although one of the real gifts of the virus, ironically, could be that Trump is seen by Americans as having really failed, and that becomes a defining failure that leads to him losing his next election. Right. So that would be the in terms of climate change and the global economy and sort of decency in public life, that would be the biggest gift we could all have. But interestingly, there's momentum ratcheting all the time. Like just last week, we have a new government elected in South Korea. Most of you probably don't follow South Korean politics that much. They're really important from climate change point of view. Korea is a big developed economy and one of the last developed economies still investing in and financing coal-fired power overseas. Their government, the party in government, promised to commit to net zero 2050 and to stop coal financing. as part of their manifesto promise. They've had a massive coronavirus boost because they've been seen to handle it really well. They've been elected on a very big majority, so they've immediately said they're going net zero 2050 and stopping international coal finance. So that's something that wasn't really expected 2 months ago. Some of the hardest, oil companies, Shell, BP, and Repsol have all now committed to net zero by 2050. The devil will be in the detail, but they've made the rhetorical commitment at least, and we know they're working on it. One of the biggest companies in South Africa, Eskom, which is all about burning coal, their CEO just said that he knows there's no future in coal. They don't know how to get off it because it's such a fragile economy and there's a big just transition issue. But I think everybody understands the science apart from a few nutters, and there's a real sense that this is an inevitable transition. We have to make it. It's a question of how to navigate it skillfully, which is really challenging for governments and businesses alike.
I mean, one of the things I know you're working on, Nigel, is whole system change. You've got these different work streams working on some of these challenges where we have to think across business and government, both local government, national government, and civil society and finance. And we've got to all come together to drive systems change. Could you give people an example of one of those work streams to just help bring to life how you see change happening and why you're excited about that model?
Yeah, I'll give my favorite one is the end of the internal combustion engine. Most often when we're thinking about change, we try and find a silver bullet or one lever, and then pull as hard as we can on that. And if that doesn't work, then we feel like we failed. But we know the way that systems actually change, and it's not in a linear way. You can never know. I mean, no one was funding youth climate strikes 3 years ago, right? And probably the most significant social event of the last 3 years has been that phenomenon. So you never know where change is going to come from. So that's the first thing, is just to take a more holistic view and say, what are the 7 or 8 or 10 big potential influences over a given system? So when we think about the internal combustion engine, policy is one. The UK saying they're banned the internal combustion engine makes a big difference. Technology is another one. Tesla driving up the quality and down the cost of electric vehicles is another one. All of the innovation driving down battery costs is another one. What investors are thinking is another one. If investors start saying they will prefer to invest in car companies that have a clear path to an electric future, because Moody's are changing their credit ratings, that's another one. Mayors trying to clean up their city air and saying they're only going to allow clean cars and trucks in their city centres by 2030 is another one. Fleet owners saying they'll only buy it. So there's so many, citizens saying I'll never buy it. So there's so many different influences, and you never know which one's going to go big or go viral or which one's going to really affect. So that's the first thing, is to actually not, because as individuals we have to choose one that we're going to do, but when you're looking at the systems change, is to be aware that they're all there. The other one is to be really aware that systems don't change gradually and in a linear way. They change not at all for a very long time, and then they change very fast, because industrial transformation always happens exponentially. And despite the fact that we know that, so much of the thinking about change pretends or assumes that it's going to be linear. It says, oh, we're only at 3%. But if we're at 3% this year and we were at 1.5% last year, then we're doubling every 12 months. That's much more relevant than the low level. It's how the rate of change. Because if we double again, that goes from 3 to 6, and then 6 to 12, and then 12 to 24, and then you're halfway there. And suddenly no one's got any doubt, and everyone's scrambling to get out of the old industry and into the new.
So if you take something like the end of manufacturing companies making internal combustion engine vehicles, moving to electric, 2-wheelers, 3-wheelers, 4-wheelers, trucks, and that being powered by clean energy, what's your hope in terms of bringing that date forward? Stick your neck out a little bit and tell us what we should be aiming for.
So this is also important, the sort of dynamic nature of our relationship with the future, right? As though we often talk about the future as though we understand it and we're just marching our way towards it. When the Paris Agreement was sealed in late 2015, in early 2016, the global community was assuming we'd still be building internal combustion engines to 2060 or 2070. The oil industry was very confident. Fatih Birol, head of the International Energy Agency, was very confident. Now, everybody knows that the combustion engine is probably going to die by 2040, so 20, 30 years earlier. I think it will die in the late 2020s. Because every time these signals get stronger, they embolden everybody else. So when the UK says and France say we'll ban in 2040, and London and Paris start saying we'll have zero carbon zones in 2030. I mean, I was on an advisory board at Daimler, so I can talk about this with some knowledge. That's part of what helps Daimler commit to Mercedes, the inventor of the combustion engine, being net zero by 2039. And that was cars. And then within the company, a year later, the truck division says we'll be net zero 2039. That makes it easier for the UK government to say, oh, okay, we'll go 2035 or 2032. So every time you have a front runner who raises the bar in one sector, it makes it easier for others to do that. So I think that basically buses will be all electric by 2025, cars by 2030, and trucks by 2035. Yesterday, Volvo and Daimler just did a deal to develop fuel cell trucks. That's about a third of the European market. So that basically determines the technology direction. You might have seen National Express, big bus company in the UK that many people know. They've already bought their last diesel bus. So it's today for them. It's now. They'll never buy another diesel bus. So I don't think 5 years is unrealistic for buses, and 10 for cars, and 15 for trucks.
And Nigel, you said you'd mentioned the US. Tell us a little bit about how you see the role of the US. And I know it's important to distinguish between cities and states and government, and indeed the engine of business. But talk a little bit about that.
I mean, we have a disastrous presidency at many levels, right? In terms of, but in terms of the environment, certainly. And we have a presidency who's pulled out the Paris Agreement, which every single country was in. So he sort of legitimized bad behavior. So we're seeing some mirroring of that from some other countries. He's also systematically been rolling back environmental regulation. Recently, just rolled back regulation on fuel efficiency. It's interesting though. He doesn't have as much power. Like the other day when he said he'll tell the governors what to do. Well, it's a federal system. Very quickly after Trump was elected, two things happened. The first thing it happened just before the COP that was in Morocco in 2016. First thing that happened was the 50 most vulnerable countries in the world to climate change, the so-called Climate Vulnerable Forum, all unilaterally within a week said we will go 100% renewable energy by 2050. So we always think about the big emitters, but these small, most vulnerable countries have often shown the most courageous moral leadership by saying we're just going to do it, right? And that does put interesting pressure on, even though they're not big emitters or big economies. And then this big coalition called We Are Still In was launched in America, which is businesses, churches, universities, investors, cities, and states, all saying, well, the federal government might say we're out, but we're still in. So funnily enough, it had a kind of galvanizing counter effect. And that coalition is still very strong. They come together to go to the COPs every year to sort of represent a strong, progressive American voice. They're growing. They're getting more ambitious. I think, this him rolling back the fuel efficiency standards is very interesting because California has got a special status, and now a lot of states are basically siding with California and saying, no, we're going to keep driving forward with the fuel efficiency standards that were agreed under Obama, and we're just going to basically separate out. So you've got a kind of bifurcation within the states on regulation. And then there's the fact that America doesn't make the market anymore. China's the biggest automotive market. Europe's similar size to North America. So if America goes on its own, then American industry will lose. It's just a competitiveness. They're just shooting themselves in the foot competitively, and the industry knows that. But they're having to juggle a very unpredictable president with the fact that they've all got big markets in Europe and China, which are driving them to more fuel efficiency and to electrification much quicker. So I think there's a certain amount of decoupling between a climate denying president and pragmatists in state governments and in businesses, and then the result of the American election will be a big deal, right? Because it won't help climate action if Trump is re-elected, that's for sure. Although he's an opportunist, so you never know. Maybe he'll even realize that the economic tides are against him, and that actually, whatever he says, he can't stop American coal-fired power plants from closing because they're just not economic.
So Nigel, people have tuned into this, of course, because we all care hugely about these issues and about the future. as well as the present. What would you say to people struggling with, what can I do? What's my role? What should I be hopeful about? Give us a little bit of a sense of how you would encourage us, people spread all around the world, to be thinking about this.
Yeah. I mean, Tom and Christiana have just written a lovely book called The Future We Choose. That might be a first tip, is read that. And noticeably, they spend, I think, only 5% of the book talking about how bad the future could be if we don't act. So my first piece of advice would be not to indulge in excessive reading of what I call gloom porn. Just as sort of the excessively graphic description of how bad things will get if we don't do anything. It's important to understand it, right? But you can't, if you just read more and more books about 4 degrees, 6 degrees, the uninhabitable Earth, it doesn't really teach you anything. Once you know that the science is bad, then you know enough to know that we need to concentrate on solutions. And wallowing in the problems doesn't motivate. It can overwhelm. It can make you angry. It can make you depressed. So I think first thing is get in a solution mindset. Know enough about the science to know how serious the issue is, but get in a solution mindset. And then maybe and there's lots of, it depends who you are, what your agency is. And if you're involved in a school as a parent or as a teacher, then schools are amazing places in terms of education, but also, how can the school go to renewable energy? Can the school grow some of its own foods? Can the school, instead of having meat-free Fridays, have vegetarian-free Fridays? Or have, instead of meat being, non-meat being the special day, how about meat being the special day? So instead of 1 day vegetarian, have 4 days vegetarian. I mean, there's so many things that we can do. Most of us, if we're living comfortable middle-class lives, have 4 or 5 major capital assets: our home, which has a boiler, and our car, and our kitchen. So over a 10-year period, often some of those objects will be replenished. So over a 10-year period, you can shift from gas cooking to electric cooking. You can shift your power from being fossil fuel to renewable. You can shift from an internal combustion engine to electric vehicles. So if you take a 10-year time scale, it's very easy to halve your emissions with known technology. You don't have to work that hard, and you can probably do much more than that. So I'd say be in a solution mindset and don't get overwhelmed by the size and think you've got to do everything tomorrow, because then you end up feeling impotent. But if you, over 10 years, you can do an awful lot to massively reduce your own, and that's just your own emissions. And then depending on your you can then look at how your money's invested. If you have pensions, as I say, if you're associated with a school or a university or a company, you can ask, what's your company doing? And some of the things that we'll be doing together with the countdown event in October, inviting all those groups to join in that and learn what they can do. So, and there's lots of really good material on the internet and books. I think that, and do something, right? Definitely don't get stuck in the, well, I'm only one person out of 8 billion. What I do makes no difference, right? That's a lie, and it's kind of cowardly, right? Everybody makes a difference, and you never know how you're going to influence other people. You never know when your mum might be, Nigel's gone vegetarian, that's interesting, and start having a few more vegetable soups, or how your friends who you thought were all climate deniers suddenly start getting interested in electric vehicles. So never forget that you're all massively networked, and what you do does influence other people, even if they will never tell you that you influence them.
Wonderful. Nigel, I want to just give a bit of space for questions. Sophia, for people who want to ask questions, could you just very quickly describe, and we're going to collect 3 or 4 questions from people, and then I'm going to give Nigel a chance to respond. So Sophia, just tell us what to do if you want to ask a question.
Yes, we're going to use the raise hand function. If you're on your computer, you can look at the bottom of the Zoom window, and then there you will find the icon. If you can't see it, just click the participants icon, and in the bottom of the chat, you will see an icon that says raise hands. So just click it. And if you're on your phone, click your screen, and the bar of icons will appear on the bottom of your screen. If you can find the icon, click the icon that has 3 dots and says more, and that will open up all the functions.
Okay.
And we also had some questions in the chat. So we will.
So I need to keep it moving. So have you, Sophia, could you just pick out 2 or 3 where people have raised their hand to say they want to ask a question?
Sure.
Could you just call out a couple of names for me?
When I call your name, you can unmute yourself. Let's start with Safran.
Okay, hi guys. Sorry, I'm just in early morning.
The
dark. Yeah. So nice to see you all, and thanks Nigel for this good opening. And this, I wanted to ask you that to see right now as we see that we are going on an economic recession, the whole world, and how more benefit that we can get advantage of the current situation to move forward towards a more greener economy, because this also allows, this is not something that we didn't expect this, but this is the most unexpected that we got, and how best we can use it so that we can move forward, so that how you see businesses and also factories, oil companies right now, many of the oil companies, the prices are going down. So all these are changing. So it's just really nice to see how do you see the way forward and how they can use it and how advantageful it is.
Thank you, Safran. So this question of building back better, what I called in the title of this talk, the Great Regeneration, out of such an economic calamity, which of course is causing huge suffering for many people. So that's one question. Let's capture a couple more before we pass back to Nigel. Who else have you got, Sophia?
Gabrielle, can you unmute yourself?
Hi, everyone, and hi, Nigel. Thanks for typically interesting and good, and also hopeful for the whole process. So you've cheered me up immensely. I wanted to come back to your point about the levers, about how in a systemic problem, you don't just look for one lever, you look for many, and you don't know which ones are going to have the biggest effect. I just wanted your observations on something I've been hearing a lot and seeing a lot, which is what I call the phenomenon of my solution, not yours. I find a lot of the time these days I'm saying we need everything on the table, and yet I'm seeing a lot of we should be doing what I think, we shouldn't be doing what you think within the space.
Thank you, Gabrielle. And then Sophia, one more.
Okay, let's go with Isabel Gornal.
Hi, thank you so much. Nigel, I wanted to ask you 2 things. The first one is that I've heard a few quite senior people in the UK government say that they think that because of the global politics around that, they might be able to use that as an excuse for why COP26 may not be as successful as the Paris year. How do we ensure that we don't use that as an excuse in terms of not being able to get mass global support for this? And secondly, what do you think is the role of a carbon tax in terms of policy?
Okay.
Thank you, Nigel. Okay, we've bundled those up, so off you go.
Yeah. So Safran, look, I think first of all, I think that we should not be naive. I mean, I've heard some people say, "Oh, this has changed everything. We'll never go back to where we were before." I wouldn't be. I don't think we should be so naive. Some things probably will stick. Like we'll probably use this technology more going forward because we've all learned to be more skillful at it. It might take quite a long time for flying levels to return, but you know, the emissions in our economy are deeply embedded in the structure of the economy. So I think whilst there may be some behavioural changes, I think without structural changes, they won't last. I think that the conversation that's really important is about the big structural economic stimulus packages that will come after the initial kind of economic stopping the economic hemorrhaging, and make sure that we don't. And this is a very different kind of recession we're going to go into, but you know, 2008, a lot of the stimulus was quantitative easing, which basically just exacerbated structural inequalities and inflated asset prices. So kind of looked okay at macroeconomically, and I think we're in a very different world now and a very different type of recession. So much more of I think what we need to see and what we will see is much more of a set of economic stimuluses which are aimed at shaping the direction of the recovery at a more granular level. So addressing in addressing inequality more. As I said, we're already seeing that in the language of politics in power in the UK and the States. And then I think that we'll need to see some more sophisticated fiscal stimulus to encourage, earlier adoption of some of the clean technologies and some targeted research and development investment to accelerate. So I think there will be an opportunity to actually speed up the transition. And as you say, that we may end up with quite a lot of oil assets effectively stranded now and very difficult to unstrand. Gabrielle, I think that's kind of my solution, not yours, normally comes from a scarcity mindset and from fear of not getting funding. So I think there's only two ways I can think of to get away from that. One is to avoid getting sucked into it and be generous ourselves and recognize that just because someone's got a different theory of change or a different approach doesn't mean they're wrong and we're right. None of us know whether the thing we're doing is going to work and the thing that someone else is doing is not going to work. So I think so from a scarcity to an abundance mindset, and then I think the other one is to have a more of a holistic view and recognize that there's lots of things that could work, and actually what we need is all of them contributing because they actually all influence each other. I remember about 6 months ago we were doing with Bill Sharp and Leaders Quest a workshop with 25 activists from European NGOs working on decarbonising heavy industry. That's a pretty dry topic, right? Pretty geeky, but really important. That's a big chunk that's like about a quarter of emissions. But how do you decarbonise steel and cement, right? And at the beginning, we just asked everybody to introduce themselves by saying what gave them hope. And 90% of them said what gave them hope was school strikes. So school strikes have a direct impact on politics because they make politicians think, oh, these are voters of the future, I better change. But they also have a positive effect on other activists who've been grinding away for 10 years, 20 years, 30 years. And that's hard to keep, some of you are activists who've been doing this for a long time. It's hard to keep going when you're failing. You don't see the system transforming in the way you want. So I think that a lot of that's around having a more generous and a more holistic mindset. Isabel, I've not heard those excuses. I think the UK has pretty much nailed its colours to the mast with its commitment to A, net zero 2050, which it now has to deliver in the 6th carbon budget, and B, hosting the COP. I think the UK government's very aware that there's sort of for those two reasons there's credibility's on the line. I don't think we'll see it as, and there might be some people, but I don't think we'll see it as an excuse, and I don't think that the world would accept it as an excuse, to be honest. I think that the civil society is going to hold the UK government to a very high standard of ambition and delivery. And then a carbon tax is a good idea. The person who's literally written the book on it called Planetary Economics, Michael Grubb, does a very good explanation of why carbon tax won't work in every instance. So it doesn't. If you put a carbon tax on petrol, it won't change the cars people buy. We've actually already got a massive tax on petrol, and people still buy SUVs. If you put a carbon tax on coal, it kills it at a relatively low level. So I think you have to be thinking. So there's basically some areas you can't get a big enough carbon tax for it to be politically acceptable and to make a difference. Some areas it's behavioural change that's needed, so you need product standards rather than tax. Other areas it will tip the economics.
Nigel, there's a lot of other questions on the chat, and I'm sorry we won't be able to get to everything. I just want to pull out two, if I may. One is a question about the left-right politics. You were, outspoken, as it were, about the US president. Just how do we make sure we're inclusive enough, and how do you see this challenge? Because I know that's very important to you, actually. How do we make room for people from different political perspectives in this movement?
Yeah, well, I don't think climate is intrinsically a political issue, in the sense of left right. I mean, Trump's an extraordinary exception. I mean, there's no reason why tackling climate change shouldn't be embraced by the right. I mean, in the UK it's very bipartisan, right? In Europe it's very bipartisan. I mean, so you can argue about the details of policy, but you can't argue about the science. And I think it's increasingly very difficult to argue about the industrial competitiveness issue. And so whether you want jobs as a trades unionist or whether you want profit as a capitalist, you don't want all of your car factories to be shut. You don't want all of the technology you use to generate your power to be built somewhere else. So it's just increasingly left or right. It's economic folly to not be taking part in a global transformation of the economic system. So David picked up my use of the word progressive. I wouldn't normally use that. I wouldn't use that word in the States, David. It's because it's got a particular meaning, just like socialism in the States means communism, and progressive means it's got quite left-wing connotations. So yeah, you're right to pick me up on that, David. I will be more careful in the States, and remember that it's an international audience. I'll be more careful here. So I think, but again, we're all, anyone who's trying to change a system, we'll have to adapt our language to whoever we're talking to. So of course I would talk about the issues slightly differently if I was talking to somebody who's primarily sees themselves as a capitalist and as capitalism being what drives a thriving society. I mean, we can see that forms of capitalism which drive inequality to extremes end up pushing back. I mean, Karl Polanyi wrote The Great Transformation, basically about the first really big free market and laissez-faire experiment, which led to labor movements, health and safety regulation, children at work regulation, ultimately the welfare state. So I think what we're seeing now is it's quite a strong systemic pushback from a period of pushing the system excessively in one direction, and now we're seeing some of the pushback.
I want to finish with one last question that's just popped up on the chat, which I touched on earlier. So the moving back of the date of COP, how do we use that to our advantage? Give people a little window into why, in some part, you actually think this could make quite a transformational difference to the outcomes.
I mean, it's not guaranteed, right? But first of all, it moves the event itself away from the American elections. So of course, whatever the outcome of the elections, it means that the COP won't be held in the media shadow of an election. So where it struggles to attract attention. Second of all, it will give us more space for some of the diplomacy. As I mentioned, South Korea is just committed. So Europe and the UK will have their strong plans in place and their so-called nationally determined contributions by the end of the year. It will give more time for diplomacy between the EU and China to encourage China to come forward with a really solid plan. It will give more time for some of the really burgeoning work looking at sectoral approaches where we start seeing coalitions. Shipping's an interesting one, right? Until 2 years ago, everyone thought shipping's just impossible to decarbonize. And then the Energy Transitions Commission wrote a report called Mission Possible, showed that there was a technical pathway there. Maersk, the biggest container shipping company in the world, committed to net zero by 2050. Then people start to do the maths and realize, oh my God, if we're going to get to net zero by 2050, we have to have zero carbon ships on the water commercially viable by 2030. And then if you want to have them on the water in 2030, you've got to start building them in 2027. And if you want to build them in 2027, you've got to place the order in 2025. And if you place the order in 2025, you need to design it in 2023. Shit, that's 3 years away. So now there's a big coalition called Getting to Zero of shipping companies and all around that ecosystem trying to drive that collectively. So I think that's the other big thing, is we'll see the chance for a lot more of that kind of sectoral collaboration, whether it's the steel sector, the aluminium sector, the trucking sector, where along the value chain and the different policy and investor levers come together, and we'll have more time to do that. And I think we'll see a series of events, Countdown in October. I think we might then have some sectoral events around the world in November. Davos in January will pick the baton up. So I think we might be able to really build some more momentum than we would have been able to between now and November.
Thank you, Nigel. Really wonderful to have you join us. Really appreciate the time, and thrilled to have had so many people dial in for this call. Thank you very much, everybody, for being here. I'm just going to finish with 2 messages. One, Nigel, you mentioned Countdown. TED Countdown, for those of you who haven't yet come across it, in fact, we'll put a message out after this, is our wonderful partnership with TED and others, a whole group of organizations that have come together around a big movement, a big initiative to help take spurn ideas and solutions to take the world to halve global emissions in the next 10 years and get to zero by 2050. We'll be announcing actually later on today, so I'm giving you a preview, that we're turning our big events of October virtual. So we'll be running global events all over the world in October, and we'll be running in-person events next spring, most likely in April. So would love all of your engagement. There's room for everybody to be involved in Countdown.